AI is kind of making this transition possible from sort of manual decision making and data gathering to augmented decision making and decision intelligence to perhaps fully automated decision making on the sort of far end of the spectrum.
Parsa Ghaffari is the head of product innovation at Quantexa, a decision intelligence platform that creates a unified view of networks to identify risks and hidden connections. Parsa joined Quantexa in 2023 after the company acquired his startup Aylien, an AI tool used to pull data and insights from news articles. An avid coder since the age of 8, Parsa founded Aylien straight out of university and jumped headfirst into the world of natural language processing. Fast forward to today, Parsa's vision at Quantexa is about harnessing the power of data and generative AI to aggregate data from a variety of sources, offering what they call a single client view. But while generative AI is poised to be a powerful tool for industries, are those industries poised for generative AI? Today we're talking about just some of the hurdles that organizations face when integrating these tools, from the quality of their own data to keeping up with the rapid pace of technological development alongside the sluggishness of regulatory change. It's never been a better time to speak to Parsa to examine these challenges and what the future could look like. This is BCG on Compliance, a podcast that explores today's most pressing criminal trends and how compliance professionals are adapting to stay ahead of that curve. I'm Hanyo Seibert. Let's dive right into it. I would start with a question on what are the biggest challenges that you're seeing, Parsa, with some of your clients around risk and compliance?
So I think those challenges that our customers are facing could be, broadly speaking, broken down into two areas. Number one is efficiency, so managing the cost of compliance in general and the efficiency of doing so. The industry is plagued with a high rate of false positives when it comes to things like transaction monitoring, update work in KYC processes. Those essentially cause efficiency-related issues. The second area where we see a lot of challenges is around effectiveness, right? So if you look at a traditional AML system and the types of approaches that were traditionally deployed, they essentially miss a lot, right? So the evidence is really in the news and in the fines that get issued to banks and other financial institutions. So there's a strong need for better analytics, more connected data to be able to find, quote unquote, the bad guys. And then perhaps a third sort of smaller area is just the pace of technology change, right? So for example, with AI, obviously, we've been through a couple of waves of AI solutions, which have sort of delivered to varying extents. We now have generative AI as obviously with technology with a lot of potential. However, I guess in financial services, for example, the regulatory environment and the role it plays in adoption of technology and innovation is quite important. So when it comes to things like model risk governance, for example, those things are not traditionally good at rapid change. So you kind of have this conflict between a sort of big technological accelerator in, say, AI, but at the same time, a relatively conservative and slow-moving sort of regulatory system. That's probably a third area where we see our customers facing challenges.
On the third point, just to pick that up, it almost feels like it deserves an episode for itself. What's the balance between opportunities for the industry versus threats to the market from a perspective that, as you say, right, a lot of the governance, a lot of the pace and how large global institutions are moving compared to how fraudsters and criminals can move across silos? Because I think we as an industry and we as a society need to benefit from the tech advancements. And at the same time, we need to do it in a safe and secured way, which also sets a bit of the pace versus some of the fraudsters that we're seeing in the quote-unquote market.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I think you kind of nailed it really well in terms of the paradox that exists now in the market. On the one hand, you have fraudsters deploying the most advanced generative AI. We all have heard of the news headlines where generative agents go on a phone call with the company's CFO and sort of manage to scam them of some money, or like numerous examples of, say, identity fraud using AI. And then on the flip side of that, you obviously have the regulatory considerations, which are obviously there for a good reason. So it's kind of this conundrum that the industry is going through at the minute. I fully agree that is probably a whole episode on itself.
You mentioned some of the data management challenges, because someone just said managing data in this compliant and anti-financial crime space is almost like trying to find the needle in the haystack of haystacks. But what do traditional approaches get wrong with regards to managing data in this environment when we talk about risk management and compliance?
So I think one of the key focuses, or the more traditional approaches, as we discussed, kind of get wrong, are around focusing only on internal data and not focusing on things like, say, counterparties or broader connections from those counterparties, right? So our view of the world is effectively what you would describe as a knowledge graph. So we see a bank's, let's say, customers, as well as then the various entities that they're connected with, counterparties of the bank. So you might have, let's say, a company that you're banking. That company will then in turn have directors and shareholders. Each of those directors and shareholders might be also directors and shareholders in other companies. And essentially, you kind of need to take into account all of those kind of second and third order relationships, whether you're trying to assess risks or opportunities, right? So in Quantexa, we would resolve those entities. So we would create a single view of each of those entities. And then we would also not just rely on your internal data, but we would also link those entities to third-party databases. So you get a much richer view of your clients, their counterparties, and that essentially becomes a data foundation upon which you can perform advanced analytics. So if I was to summarize it, I would say single biggest challenge we see with traditional approaches is that they only focus on internal data and not enough on external.
And you personally have a pretty interesting background with regards to natural language models and large language models. Can you talk a little bit about your trajectory from building Aylien to working with Quantexa and what you find so fascinating in this area? And I'm sure you've joined the area much earlier than the most recent Gen AI hype.
Absolutely. So my background is technical. So I've been coding since I was 8 or 9 years old. And when I finished university, I decided I wanted to start a tech company. So I started Aylien back in 2013. We were essentially trying to build a co-pilot for bloggers, right? So if you were creating a blog post and you were referring to different entities and perhaps writing an article about a company or a celebrity, the idea was that the co-pilot would suggest additional content to you that you could incorporate into your article that you were writing. This would sort of sit on top of your blogging platforms. So through doing that, sort of entered the world of natural language processing. So back then, NLP was a bit of a dark art, I'd like to call it. The know-how wasn't as freely available as it is today. LLMs certainly weren't a thing. At Aylien, we sort of try to then introduce a product to the market that would allow our customers to grab any piece of textual information and extract things like mentions of entities, the sentiment that the article or the document had towards each of those entities, generate summaries of these documents. And then ultimately where we sort of found killer use cases for our technology was with analyzing news articles for monitoring of financial and non-financial risks across kind of financial services and kind of corporations in general. And then fast forward to 2022, effectively we're looking for an acquisition around that time. So that's when we met with the Quantexa leadership, and Aylien got acquired in February of 2023 by Quantexa. Our team essentially came on board, and that's essentially now we're bringing that to the market as a joint offering. So we really enable our customers to get a very cohesive and comprehensive picture of what they're dealing with, again, whether it's compliance and risk or opportunity monitoring. And at Quantexa, I lead the innovation function as part of the product organization.
What makes Quantexa different is what they call single client view. Contrary to traditional data management methods, Quantexa combines internal and external customer data into a unified profile. For financial institutions, this could mean minimizing or combining reports and accounts and hugely mitigating the risks that can come from having more cracks to fall through.
So if I have, say, one account versus 5 accounts in 3 different countries, that means a very different thing for risk. It also has a big sort of impact downstream. So for example, in your billing and statements, you have to be very strict and you will accept delivering 3 statements. Whereas in credit risk, you would join those accounts together. In AML, you would probably go fuzzier, and you also have access to, say, sensitive data that you can utilize for creating a single view of your clients. So effectively, what we've built is extremely configurable and dynamic, and that's a kind of core enabler for the value that Quantexa delivers to our customers.
So I hear a lot banking with regards to KYC, AML, sanctions, whatever topics, but also fraud topics. But you probably have a lot of other industries you're servicing and a lot of other use cases. What type of problems are you solving right now in the industries?
So as you pointed out, we traditionally obviously started in financial services, so banking, insurance are core industries for us. Over time, essentially our vision is to become a decision intelligence platform, which obviously is a kind of multi-sector, multi-industry vision. We've been looking at healthcare and telecommunications. We also have a risk solution, which is not just confined to banking and insurance customers, but kind of goes across industries. Again, our North Star is to become a leading decision intelligence platform.
Flipping the story around a little bit, what is it that you need from clients in order to make this a success rather than a never-ending story of promising things but not delivering on either side of the story?
I really like the saying that the value of AI is probably overstated in the short term, but understated in the long term. And the potential is there. I'm personally very convinced of that. So it really then comes down to how do we sort of convey that and how do we sort of instill that confidence in our customers? Because as you say, there's a lot of, again, buzz and noise and hype in the industry. A lot of sort of half-baked solutions are being sort of thrown around. What we need from our clients is really that sort of determination, the championing and the sponsorship and the dedication that is really required to go through this kind of multi-year journey of adopting Quantexa and adopting the innovation that we deliver via AI and elsewhere.
I do see a lot of clients who want to learn a lot about AI, machine learning, Gen AI, etc. And then when I ask them about the most basic data point, say how many alerts do they have in transaction monitoring, they wouldn't know.
I mean, there's a maturity journey to go through for any organization that's looking to adopt AI. Obviously, data being a key component there. What is the sort of state of their data assets? How ready is it to apply AI to? It's really important to kind of be aware of, I think as a company selling into any given market, it's really important to be aware of the levels of maturity that exist within the market and again, sort of pick your target, I guess.
And looking ahead a little bit, what are the big trends you see, say, for the next 5 years in this space?
If I had to make a guess, I mean, as an AI person, I think AI is obviously going to have a very major role to play in the context of not just what Quantexa does, but how work is done and how decisions are made in the coming 3 to 5 years. You know, we sort of often say this in the context of decision intelligence that, you know, AI is kind of making this transition possible from sort of manual decision making and data gathering and so forth to augmented decision making and decision intelligence to perhaps fully automated decision making on the sort of far end of the spectrum. And obviously not every decision might go through that sort of full end-to-end journey all the way to sort of full automation, but many will, right? So, you know, if you imagine the job of an analyst or a mortgage broker or a salesperson, try to imagine what that might look like in, say, 5 years' time. It's probably going to be a lot less of, you know, manual data gathering, messing around with web research and spreadsheets, and a lot more really sort of applying their domain knowledge and the understanding of the customer and the market and the opportunity and the risk that they have, and perhaps collaborating with AI agents. So what I kind of personally like to imagine is a world where you kind of essentially have this ongoing dialogue with your AI co-pilot about what you're trying to achieve and getting a lot of help and support and feedback, and that AI co-pilot being grounded really in trusted and connected data sources that enable those types of decisions to be made. And I think there's huge effectiveness and efficiency gains to be had there.
I think there needs to be also an upskilling of people, especially leadership. So what needs to happen on empowerment of people in order to use it in an ethical and responsible way and be able to actually use it in that way? Question 2, how do we avoid a minority report type scenario where if the machine knows everything and makes predictions based on all the information it gathers, also predicting future behavior? So how do you get away from this kind of machine knowing everything, you're being a super transparent human being and there's no privacy anymore? And third question, what are some safeguards we need to put around all of the innovation that you were mentioning, Parsa?
Absolutely. So I think just taking those in turn, in terms of the education and the empowerment that is required, both to leadership, but also the kind of overall workforce, I completely agree. I think that's a really key consideration that could sometimes get overlooked as companies look at the opportunity that comes with AI. One of the key things there is like that deliberate and dedicated effort towards education and enablement on AI. I think it's as important to understand the opportunity and the benefits as it is to understand the risks and the downsides and the limitations that AI has today. One of the things I've seen some organizations do is establish new teams, essentially purely focus on AI education within the organization. I think that's a really good way of manifesting this and putting this into practice. Those education programs should really start at the leadership. Moving on to your second question about this sort of more dystopian, I guess, outlooks for AI and adoption of AI technology. Look, I think there is some inherent risk in sort of having negative societal impact. But I think overall, no technology comes with zero downside. I think there's always going to be some downside to technology, and it's a case of managing that downside through regulations, through AI ethics, and then balancing that again with the opportunity, which hopefully is far superior to those downsides. And then if I can sort of tack on maybe the third point you mentioned, the fraud piece and this kind of powerful technology in the hands of fraudsters. One of the key things that I think is a great mitigator for that is this kind of open source approach to AI now that has been advocated for by some companies. And I think this kind of open source approach to AI is ultimately what's going to maximize the likelihood of AI being developed safely and sort of, again, mitigating some of those downside risks that you mentioned. For example, it getting into the hands of the fraudsters and or, again, replacing jobs or various other kind of downsides that are possible from AI. So those are some of the areas that companies should focus on. And I guess, again, some of the mitigation strategies that hopefully we will deploy as a society to mitigate those risks.
Great. Final question for this episode. What would be your advice for leaders of companies being responsible for compliance, risk, or economic crime topics in adapting technology and AI, if they're playing around with it but haven't yet fully embraced it?
So it all starts with data. It all comes down to the quality of your data, whether it's internal only or if you're kind of also considering important external data sources, whether you have a robust and trusted process for combining those two sources of data. Because again, ultimately your AI is only as good as your data, right? So if your data isn't good, you're not really going to reap the benefits of AI. And compared to your competitors who might have made that investment into their data foundation. And then the second point is, as we kind of alluded to earlier, around education, empowerment, skills. So investing in education around AI within your organization. And maybe the last and final point on this is we're in a very fast-paced environment with the sort of great potential of AI. So it's really crucial to stay abreast of the various AI regulations that are coming out in different jurisdictions around the world.
Excellent. Parsa, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
That was Parsa Ghaffari, Head of Product Innovation at Quantexa. How could improvements in data management elevate your organization? And do you think Gen AI is part of that shift? Join the conversation by connecting with us on your podcast app, writing a review of the show, or emailing us at bcgoncompliance@bcg.com. Be sure to subscribe to get more insights from compliance innovators. I'm Hanya Zaiwit. Thanks for listening.